Okay, so welcome to the last of the series of lectures on Marx, Hegel, and dialectic. This one is titled The Dialectic of Nature, or the Nature of Dialectic, and its Critics. Over to Sean.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Thanks again for organising these lectures. I'm really very grateful to you for that. And thanks particularly for everybody for turning up to them. I'm very grateful for that too. I'm honoured by having such a good audience. Okay, the topic today, as Paul said, is the dialectic of nature and its critics, particularly the dialectic of nature as explained by Engels. Okay, few philosophers have been more unjustly abused and defamed than Engels, and particularly for his ideas about the dialectic of nature. He is accused of being uneducated and ignorant, of knowing little of Hegel's ideas and understanding less, of peddling a crudely positivistic and mechanistic form of materialism. Now, it seems to me it would be pointless and tedious to respond to these charges in detail. In my view, they are all completely false. Engels was an immensely wide-ranging and knowledgeable thinker. He grew up at a time when German thought was dominated by Hegel's philosophy, and he was steeped in it. He continued to draw on Hegel's ideas throughout his life, as his continual references to Hegel in his philosophical works makes evident. The underlying ideas of Hegel's philosophy are drawn from a deep understanding of Hegel's philosophy in an original and fruitful way, as I will argue. The non-reductive, dialectical form of materialism that he develops is entirely different from positivistic and mechanistic forms of it that he is accused of holding. I shall focus particularly on the idea that nature is dialectical. This seems at first to be a very abstract and purely logical topic, but it has important implications, and it has given rise to controversies about fundamental philosophical issues over the years. It has been much criticized, and Engels has been a particular target for attack. But it is not clear why Engels is singled out. The idea was not invented by Engels, and it is not peculiar to him. The idea of a dialectic of nature is part of a larger philosophy of dialectic, the modern source of which is, of course, Hegel. According to this, everything concrete undergoes changes, and at the basis of these changes are contradictions that are inherent in them. Hegel, these are metaphysical, logical that apply to all, whether in the realm of society or thought. The idea that nature is dialectical is an intrinsic part of this philosophy. There is nothing special about it. This philosophy was taken up and adapted by Marx and Engels. In the division of labor between them, the job of elaborating and explaining it fell to Engels. He did this as an integral part of his defense of the dialectical and materialist outlook as a whole. Nevertheless, the idea that there are dialectical processes in nature has been singled out, and Engels has been castigated for holding it, so he is primarily responsible for it. This idea, it is said, commits the elementary logical error of attributing contradictions to mere things, whereas logical contradictions, properly so called, can exist only in the realm of human thought and activity. Between natural objects, there can only be non-contradictory forms of opposition or conflict. That's the argument. Engels quotes Dühring as asserting that, and I quote, this is from Dühring, of course, contradiction is a category which can only appertain to a combination of thoughts, but not to reality. There are no contradictions in things. Engels' claim that there are contradictions in nature, according to Dühring, commits an elementary logical fallacy by failing to make this simple logical distinction. This argument has been repeated ever since. As Richard Norman, one of my colleagues here in Kent, for example, puts it, he writes, "We need to distinguish between conflicts in the natural world and conflicts in human thought and activity. One and the same force cannot be in conflict with itself. The conflict is between one force and another, not a conflict within one force. But one and the same person can hold conflicting beliefs, and it is in such a case that we can talk of self-contradiction." That's Richard Norman. The Italian Marxist philosopher, or erstwhile Marxist philosopher, Lucio Coletti, spells out this point at length. A logical contradiction holds between a term and its negation, he asserts. It is expressed by the formula A and not A. He writes, and I quote, "Each opposite cannot stand without the other and vice versa. In and for itself, it is nothing. It is the negation of the other and nothing else." End of quote. In a contradiction, each opposite is not only opposed to, it is also united with the other. A contradiction is a unity of opposites. Again, to quote Coletti, each pole of the contradiction is itself negative, being simply the negation of the other. Its essence lies outside itself, in its opposite. It follows that if each pole is to be itself, it must imply the relation to the other, that is, the unity of opposites. That's Coletti. A dialectical relation then involves a contradiction of this form. In nature, by contrast, it is argued, there are only what Coletti calls real opposites that have nothing in common with each other. Things in nature are entirely distinct and separate from each other. They are not united. They are merely different. They are external to each other. Conflicts between them are expressed by the formula A and B. In nature, in other words, and I quote Coletti, each of the opposites is real and positive. Each subsists for itself. This is an exclusive opposition instead of an inclusive opposition. Hence, real extremes do not mediate each other. Well, now, similar views are expressed by many, many other writers. According to Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, he writes, "The mainspring of all dialectics is the idea of totality. In it, phenomena are never isolated appearances. When they occur together, it is always within the higher unity of a whole. They are bound together by inner relationships. That is, the presence of one modifies the other in its inner nature." So, like Coletti, Sartre maintains that a dialectical relation involves a contradiction and has the form of a unity of opposites. Such inner conflict, and hence inner movement and life, exists only in the realm of human thought and activity. Lukács and Alfred Schmidt express similar views, and many others too. In nature, by contrast, there are no contradictions, according to these people. Natural objects have no movement and life of their own. Change comes to them only from without. According to Sartre, and I quote again, matter is characterized by its inertia. This means it is incapable of producing anything by itself. It is a vehicle of movements and energy, and it always receives these movements and this energy from without. And thus, going on quoting Sartre, a material object is animated from without, is subject to forces which always come from elsewhere, is composed of elements that unite, though without interpenetrating, and that remain foreign to it. It is exterior to itself. End of quote. In short, according to these writers, dialectic occurs only in the realm of human thought and activity. There is no dialectic of things. Similar assertions could be quoted from many other authors who argue in similar terms. These views, it is claimed, are simply the expression of the elementary logical principle that there can be no contradictions in things. But it is clear, I think, that more than mere formal logical ideas are being put forward here. Substantial philosophical views are being asserted, views about the character of the natural world, about the realm of human thought and activity, and the differences between them. Now, as regards the natural world, what is being said is what is being asserted, I should say, is a purely mechanistic picture of it. According to this, natural entities are distinct and separate from each other and only externally related. For as Hegel says, the mechanical view sees things, and I quote now, as complete and self-subsistent objects, that consequently, even in connection, relate to one another as each standing on its own, each maintaining itself in every combination as external. This is what constitutes the character of mechanism, namely, that whatever the connection that obtains between the things combined, the connection remains one that is alien to them. That does not affect their nature. The connection remains nothing more than composition, mixture, aggregate, and so on. That's table. Moreover, the mechanical view regards entities as inert and passive. They are solely positive. Negation, and hence change, can come to them only from outside. This principle is fundamental to the mechanical point of view. It is embodied in Newton's first law of motion, the law which states an object either remains at rest or continues to move at a constant velocity unless acted upon by a force. And it is expressed in the classical empiricist view that a material object, in Locke's words, is inactive and has, as he puts it, not the power to produce motion of itself. Now, these are not merely formal logical claims. They are large metaphysical theses about the character of the material world, and questionable ones, as we shall shortly see. The criticism of the idea of the dialectic of nature that I've been describing also imply philosophical ideas about the realm of human thought and activity. This is portrayed as completely distinct and different from the natural world, as a realm of internality that is capable of sustaining internal contradictions, as the realm of logic and thought governed by rational principles. Again, these are not merely formal logical views, they are major metaphysical theses, and they too are questionable. One of Engels' philosophical achievements is to criticize both these views and to develop a dialectical and materialist account of both nature and thought, and of the relation between them. The mechanistic view of nature was created by scientists and philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries. The development of mechanics and physics in this period constituted an enormous advance in the human understanding of the natural world. The great successes of scientists in explaining the behavior of physical phenomena suggested to many that it could be extended to understand all reality in purely material and mechanical terms. And so in this period, these ideas were generalized by philosophers such as Hobbes, Gassendi, Lemaitre, de Holbach, into a metaphysical theory, which claimed to be able to provide a complete account of all natural phenomena. According to this philosophy, all reality is purely material or physical in character, and could be understood and explained in mechanical and physical terms alone. Even the most complex natural phenomena can be accounted for in this way. All living things, including human beings, are merely complex material bodies acting in accordance with the laws of mechanics and physics. Human thought and feeling is nothing but the material activity of the brain and the nervous system. It can, in principle, be reduced to and explained by the laws of mechanics and physics. Engels calls this philosophy mechanistic materialism. A descendant of these views, updated to take account of subsequent developments in physical sciences, currently goes under the name of physicalism. It is still widespread and influential today. Many philosophers, however, who accept the mechanistic account of purely material phenomena, argue that it cannot be extended to the realm of human thought and activity. Human beings are distinct from the rest of natural creation, it is claimed. They are governed by different principles. A mechanistic, materialistic, and reductionist theory is incapable of grasping the character of human subjectivity, rationality, and freedom. This way of thinking leads to various forms of dualism. This outlook, too, has many contemporary adherents. The criticisms of the idea of the dialectic of nature put forward by Dühring, Coletti, Sartre, Norman, and others presuppose a dualist position of this kind. They combine a mechanistic account of the natural world with the idea that the human realm is governed by different principles. Dialectic applies only to the realm of human thought and activity. Well, Engels rejects such dualism. He is a materialist. He rejects the idea that human thought is something separate that transcends nature. But his materialism is not of the 18th century mechanistic kind. He also questions the account of nature that is put forward by mechanistic materialists and physicalists, and that is part of the dualist position that I've been describing. He puts forward a non-mechanistic, non-reductive, dialectical form of materialism. Mechanics and physics were first developed in a rigorous fashion by natural scientists in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the mechanical conception of nature grew up in their wake. Subsequently, significant progress began to be made in the scientific understanding of other and more complex aspects of nature, including chemical, geological, biological, and social processes. In these areas, different principles come into operation and require new and different modes of understanding. New branches of knowledge were created: chemistry, geology, biology, psychology, and economic and social theory. Engels followed these developments with close attention, and they provide the basis on which he develops a non-mechanistic, non-reductive, dialectical form of materialism. This does not deny the validity of mechanics or physics as branches of knowledge. All things are mechanical and physical. All things have a mechanical and physical aspect. This is described and explained by the sciences of mechanics and physics. These are and continue to be the most rigorous and fully developed areas of natural science. However, the mechanical and physical aspects of natural phenomena is only one of their aspects. Concrete things are never solely mechanical or physical. They are always parts of other processes and have other aspects as well. The purely mechanical view of nature abstracts from these other aspects. It is blind to them and ignores them. Hegel has a clear-eyed understanding of this. He says, and I quote, he says, in nature, it is only the veriest abstract relations of matter in its inert masses which obey the laws of mechanism. On the contrary, the phenomena and operations of the province to which the term physical in its narrower sense is applied, such as the phenomena of light, heat, magnetism, and electricity, cannot be explained by any mere mechanical processes, such as pressure, impact, displacement of parts, and the like. That's the end of the quote. In chemical and biological phenomena, new, higher principles come into force. A living organism, for example, is made up of atoms and molecules that are governed by mechanical and physical laws. But an organism is not only a mechanical or physical system, and it has proved impossible to understand the structure and growth of living organisms in purely mechanical, physical, or chemical terms. Never mind the formation and evolution of living species, their distribution over the earth, and so forth and so on. Living organisms are governed by principles that cannot be reduced to purely physical or chemical terms alone. And this is not just because biological organisms are too complex to be comprehended in current mechanical, physical, or chemical terms. It is also, and primarily, because biological organisms have their own specific forms and properties. According to Engels, and I quote, life is the mode of existence, the essential element of which consists in continual metabolic exchange with the natural environment outside them, and which ceases with the cessation of this metabolism. Such metabolism can also occur in the case of inorganic bodies, and in the long run it occurs everywhere, since chemical reactions take place, even if extremely slowly elsewhere. The difference, however, is that inorganic bodies are destroyed by this metabolism, while in organic bodies, it is the necessary condition for their existence. A living organism has its own life and, as it were, its own interests. Its activity and development can be understood only in terms of laws that govern the organism as a whole, principles that concern its life and its interests, its self-preservation, and the preservation of its species. As Daniel Dennett, the contemporary American philosopher says, and I quote, when an entity arrives on the scene, capable of behavior that staves off, however primitively, its own dissolution and decomposition, it brings into the world its good. That is to say, it creates a point of view from which the world's events can be roughly partitioned into the favorable, the unfavorable, and the neutral. As the creature thus comes to have interests, the world and its events begin. As the creature thus comes to have interest, the world and its events begin creating reasons for it, whether or not the creature can fully recognize them. The first reasons pre-existed their own recognition. That's the end of Dennis' quote. There is nothing mystical about this. It is not a matter of positing a mysterious form of organic unity, or an immaterial life force, or anything like that. Living organisms are natural, material things, made up of physical and chemical constituents, and nothing more. And these obey the laws of physics and chemistry. But a biological organism is a higher and more complex form of organization of matter, governed also by higher and more complex biological principles. And mechanical and physical principles, although they continue to operate, in Hegel's words, and I quote, cease to be final and decisive, and sink, as it were, to a subservient position. And this, I think, is the absolutely crucial point. Engels echoes this line of thought when he criticizes mechanical materialism for its, quote, exclusive application of the standards of mechanics to processes of a chemical and organic nature, in which processes the laws of mechanics are indeed also valid, but are pushed into the background by other higher laws, end quote. These new higher laws do not operate independently of physical law, nor do they replace them. Rather, they act in and through them by giving a new and higher form of organization to the physical and chemical phenomena. The biological level arises in and through the physical and chemical levels, not outside or apart from it. In this way, chemical and biological forms and principles are not reducible to mechanical and physical ones, nor do they completely transcend them. The different levels are relatively autonomous, to borrow a useful concept from elsewhere in Engels' work. They are distinct, but also united, different, but also continuous with each other. According to the non-reductive, non-mechanistic, dialectical form of materialism that Engels puts forward, biological forms and laws do not supplant those of physics and chemistry. On the contrary, in a living thing, the laws of the lower physical and chemical levels continue to operate. However, with the development of living organisms, new forms emerge and develop. New biological principles come into effect, and physical and chemical processes are subsumed within a higher form. Moreover, Engels argues, these different levels can change into each other. This is a further important insight of his dialectical form of materialism. The mechanical materialism of the 18th century did not comprehend such processes of development and change. And I quote Engels, the other specific limitation of this materialism lay in its inability to comprehend the universe as a process, as matter undergoing uninterrupted historical development. This accorded with the state of the natural sciences of that time, and with the anti-dialectical manner of philosophizing connected with it. Now, of course, as Engels says, such materialism acknowledged that material entities are in motion. However, it was generally believed that natural processes move in repeated cycles. At this time, as Engels describes, and I quote again, the Kantian theory of the origin of the solar system, theory that is that the sun and the planets originated from incandescent rotating nebular masses. That theory had been put forward only recently and was still regarded merely as an oddity. The history of the development of the Earth, geology, was still totally unknown. And the conception that the animate natural beings of today are the result of a long sequence of evolution from the simple to the complex could not at that time scientifically be put forward at all. End of quote. In other words, an unhistorical view of nature prevailed. Even for Hegel, despite his thoroughly historical way of seeing what he calls the world of spirit, that is the human world, natural kinds are fixed, and movement in nature takes the form of unchanging cycles. Only gradually, from the end of the 18th century onwards, did it begin to be understood that nature must be conceived in a historical fashion as evolving and developing. Higher natural forms emerge and develop out of lower ones and can revert back to them. This occurs at all levels. Galaxies, stars, and planetary systems emerge, develop, and die. The surfaces of planets are undergoing a constant process of geological transformation. Biological organisms emerge out of inorganic matter. Living species emerge, evolve, and become extinct. Physical and chemical mechanisms are at the basis of all these developments. All of them involve physical and chemical processes. However, they cannot be comprehended in purely mechanical, physical, or chemical terms. For the historical and developmental processes involved are not recognized by the sciences of mechanics, physics, or chemistry, nor are they visible to them. New and different geological, biological, and evolutionary processes are in operation, which are not reducible to the principles of mechanics, physics, or chemistry alone. To comprehend such processes, it is necessary to go beyond purely mechanical, physical, or chemical ways of thinking and see the natural world as inherently changeable and evolving. The dialectical account of nature recognizes this. It rejects the assumptions about nature that are implicit in the criticisms of it that I've been considering. It rejects the mechanistic picture, which sees natural entities as inert and passive. Change and development do not come to them only from outside. As Hegel says, and I think I probably quoted this passage before, but he says, to materialized conception, existence stands in the character of something solely positive and quietly abiding within its own limits. Though we also know it is true that everything finite, such as existence, is subject to change. Such changeableness in existence is, to the superficial eye, a mere possibility, the realization of which is not a consequence of its own nature. But the fact is, mutability lies in the notion of existence, and change is only the manifestation of what it implicitly is. End of quote. And this implies that things are not purely positive, as I've argued repeatedly. Quote, the foundation of all determinateness is negation. The unreflecting observer supposes that determinate things are merely positive and pins them down under the form of being. Mere being, however, is not the end of the matter. It is utter emptiness and instability besides. That's Hegel. Now, such views will no doubt provoke the objection that they presuppose Hegel's idealism and mysticism by attributing living features to a purely inert and lifeless nature. According to Dialectic, for example, Hegel's insistence that there are contradictions in nature amounts to the belief that, and I quote, the finite is limited, the perishable, the ephemeral. The finite seems to be and is not. The finite is that which is fated to come to an end, that which is evanescent and devoid of value. That's Dialectic. According to Dialectic, this leads to the idealist conclusion that only the absolute has true being. a Christian viewpoint, according to Coletti, that Coletti accuses Engels, Lenin, and others of reproducing. Well, this charge, it seems to me, is without foundation. Engels does indeed believe that the finite is contradictory, and he does inherit this view from Hegel, as Coletti says. It is also true that Hegel's account of nature ultimately takes an idealist form. However, Engels does not follow Hegel in believing that only the absolute exists, nor need one do so. Engels uses some of Hegel's ideas to develop a materialist philosophy of nature. He holds that nature is indeed contradictory, and that it has a history, that natural forms change and new forms emerge and grow. There is nothing idealist about these views. Emergence, it should be added, which is a concept I've appealed to a lot in the just now, is not an explanatory concept as I am using it here. It does not attempt to explain the development of higher natural forms from lower ones. It does not propose an explanatory mechanism like Darwin's theory of genetic variation and natural selection. Rather, it describes the logical relations between different forms of organization of nature and of the different forms of explanation and branches of science needed to comprehend them. Now, these ideas and principles can also be extended to the realm of human thought and activity. According to the materialist point of view, human beings are biological organisms made up entirely of physical and chemical constituents. Human activity and thought are therefore physical, chemical, biological, natural phenomena. Nevertheless, one cannot describe or understand human activity or thought in purely mechanical, physical, chemical, or biological terms. They involve new and different forms and principles. Thought is indeed an activity of the human brain and nervous system, but it cannot be described or understood in the terms of physics, chemistry, biology, or neuroscience alone. It is governed also by psychological, social, and historical principles to which these other sciences are blind. And it is often argued that there is a fundamental difference between human and animal or other merely natural phenomena, in that unlike purely natural entities, human beings have the ability to act consciously, intentionally, and freely, and that they can act for reasons. As Kant puts it, natural events, according to this argument, occur according to laws and principles, but human beings have the ability to act from principles. These ideas imply that Marxism, as the study of human activity, must use methods which are completely different from those used in the natural sciences to explain mere things. Hegel is, of course, familiar with this line of argument. Although he insists that we should not underestimate the abilities of other animals, he agrees that there are fundamental differences between human, other animals, and forms of life. Drawing on his own abundant experience, I should explain that he was a keen fox hunter. He went fox hunting with the hounds in near outside Manchester when he was living there. Anyway, he writes, in animals, the capacity for conscious planned action attains a fairly high level. While fox hunting in England, one can daily observe how unerringly the fox makes use of its excellent knowledge of the locality in order to elude its pursuers, and how well it knows and turns to account all favorable features of the ground that cause the scent to be lost. End of quote. Nevertheless, Engels argues, there still exists fundamental differences between human abilities and those of other animals. He says, and I quote, all the planned action of all animals has never succeeded in impressing the stamp of their will upon the earth. The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. That's the end of the quote. Even this difference, though, it seems to me, may be less sharp than Engels has suggested. Beavers, for example, build dams in rivers to serve their ends and can change the environment considerably in the process. Now, it might be argued that they are driven solely by natural impulses rather than exercising what Engels calls their will, that they are acting according to principles, in Kant's terms, rather than from principles. But these, it seems to me, are not all or nothing matters, and we should beware of drawing too sharp a distinction here. In any case, Engels agrees with the Kantian view that there are fundamental differences between humans and other animals in these respects. Humans have the capacity to act for reasons and not only from natural impulse. They can separate themselves from their situation and reflect upon it. And this separation enables them to reflect and to choose among alternatives, to exercise will and choice. It enables human beings to act autonomously, freely. Now, many people will be distressed, I think, by Engels' claim that humans master nature in this way. And he himself is very aware of the problems that this language raises. Any idea that these uniquely human powers lift us above the natural world, he argues, is illusory. He says, and I quote, "Let us not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human victories over nature. For each such victory, nature takes its revenge on us and brings with it unforeseen and sometimes disastrous consequences." I quote again, "At every step, we are reminded that we by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but that we belong to nature, exist in its midst, and that all our mastery of it consists in the fact that we have the advantage over all other creatures of being able to learn its laws and apply them correctly. But the more this progresses, the more will men not only feel, but also know their oneness with nature, and the more impossible will become the senseless and unnatural idea of a contrast between mind and nature, man and nature, soul and body." That's Engels. Moreover, Engels adds, and I quote again from him, he says, "With man, we enter history. Animals also have a history, that of their descent and gradual evolution to their present position. This history, however, is made for them, and insofar as they themselves take part in it, this occurs without their knowledge and desire. On the other hand, the more that human beings become removed from animals, in the narrower sense of that word, the more they make their history themselves, consciously, the less becomes the influence of unforeseen effects and uncontrolled forces on this history." End of quote. We are social beings, and our distinctively human abilities develop historically in and through social relations. And I quote Engels again, he says, "It requires the labor of thousands of years for us to learn a little of how to calculate the more remote natural effects of our actions in the field of production, but has been still more difficult in regard to the more remote social effects of these actions." End of quote. Such knowledge is the basis of our freedom. According to Engels, again he is following Hegel, in seeing our freedom in these terms. He says, and I quote again, there are a lot of quotes from Engels here because I want to show what an interesting philosopher he is, but Engels says, Hegel was the first to state correctly the relation between freedom and necessity. To him, freedom is the insight into necessity. And this is Engels quoting Hegel. Necessity is blind, only so far as it is not understood. End of Hegel quote. Going on with Engels now. Freedom does not consist in any dreamed of independence from natural laws, but in the knowledge of these laws and in the possibility this gives of systematically making them work towards definite ends. This holds good in relation both to the laws of external nature and to those which govern the bodily and mental existence of men themselves, two classes of laws which we can separate from each other at most only in thought, but not in reality. In short, our freedom and autonomy from natural forces are not transcendent powers that separate us absolutely from the natural world, as Kant implies. They are based upon and emerge out of naturally developed and socially acquired abilities and skills. They do not operate independently of natural processes, but in and through them, by giving them a higher form of organization. They are only relatively autonomous and different from the natural conditions and social practices on which they are based. They emerge and develop gradually and by degrees in the course of biological and historical evolution. Engels thus rejects the dualistic separation of the world of human thought and activity from the rest of nature that is implicit in the criticisms of the idea of the dialectic of nature that I have been discussing. He does not privilege human abilities as transcendent and separate and apart from nature. The idea that dialectic operates in nature as well as in the human realm is a logical expression of these views. We are both material and social beings. All our activities are material, and they always occur in and through our social relations. In insisting that dialectic applies both to the natural and the social realms, Engels is affirming their unity and rejecting any attempt to drive a dualistic wedge between them. As he and Marx wrote in the German Ideology, we know of only a single science, the science of history. One can look at history from two sides and divide it into the history of nature and the history of men. The two sides, however, are inseparable. The history of nature and the history of men are dependent on each other so long as men exist. End of quote. Dialectical principles then are at work in both the natural and the human realm. Engels again says, the motion of matter is not merely crude mechanical motion, mere change of place. It is heat and light, electric and mechanical magnetic stress, chemical combination and dissociation, life, and finally, consciousness. End of quote. Nature develops. It has a history. It is dialectical. It becomes organized, or rather one should say it organizes itself in increasingly complex forms until it develops consciousness of itself. Human capacities, including consciousness and rational thought, are natural capacities that have emerged through the development of natural processes. These are the ideas, I think, that are involved in the dialectical and materialist view of nature that Engels is putting forward. Thank you. That's the end.
Thanks very much, Sean. We can start then with questions in the normal way, which is to please raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. Normally I say, please note it's a question or comment, but not a paper from the floor of considerable length, but every time I say that, people don't do it anyway. So we'll just see how it goes. Ruth.
Well, I thought since everybody jumped in at once, I would. So thank you again, and this follows from some of the points from last time. I think I just want to make a couple observations, really, as much for everybody else as for you. One thing is that at this point, believe it or not, or maybe 10 years ago, it might be on the sliding back into humanism, but there are really a lot of relevant, serious, useful resources in contemporary analytic metaphysics that develop by people who are developing neo-Aristotelian, non-Humean, or as you put it, non-mechanistic metaphysics and attendant philosophy of science. So one thing in terms of contemporary resources for talking about the kind of continuity of the natural and the social without carving out space for any purported mechanistic passivist features of the natural. Contemporary analytic metaphysics nowadays has resources for that. And that's really important to know. And Howard Engels Gertchen is someone who could point you to things like that. I would be happy to, exchange email with anybody who's interested in it. But the other point I would want to make is that I sort of think, I'll put it this way, the advantage of looking to Aristotle rather than to Hegel on this point, on precisely this point, on the non-mechanistic or non-Humean nature of nature, and by extension, human beings. The advantage of looking to Aristotle is that because of when he was writing, Aristotle does not have to have and doesn't have like mixed metaphors deep down about at the level of the metaphysics. So even in this discussion, there's the language of the natural world being governed by laws. All of that nomological infrastructure as a matter of metaphysics is post-Aristotelian. And if you take on an Aristotelian metaphysics, according to which there are kinds, and they do have powers, different ones that can be expressed or not expressed, and in virtue of which different kinds of entities are emergent vis-a-vis other aspects of themselves or the world. If you have that kind of metaphysics, you actually don't need nomological talk at all, other than perhaps to describe the behaviors of certain kinds of powerful particulars that happen to behave in regular ways. Once you get to Hegel, and even into this kind of language from Engels, I think the language of the mechanistic philosophy of natural science works its way into the discourse in a way that's not so helpful. So I would just encourage anybody who's interested in the position that you've set out, Cham, to familiarize themselves with thoroughly Aristotelian approaches to metaphysics and to the philosophy of natural science even, so that you can see ways of making this position that just simply do not have to allow for law talk in the special or not yet fully developed or superficial or whatever case of natural things. Like the Aristotelian metaphysics, the old the stuff from Aristotle and the contemporary stuff is extremely useful in this regard. And just very fast, the one last thing is I still actually don't see how it follows from human beings being fully integrated with the natural world, everybody having powers, some of which are distinctive to some kinds and some of which are shared. I'm not seeing how it follows from that metaphysics that contradiction is intrinsic to anything. Like it's an open question to me. I'd need to be convinced of why I should also think that. But the more important is that earlier stuff. And like I'm super happy to share those resources. I'm Googleable at St. Louis University if anybody's interested.
Well, thanks very much, Ruth, for that, for those points. Let me first say that I know and I fully recognize that contemporary analytic philosophy has, says many of the things that and is capable of saying many of the things that I've been saying. I totally accept that, and I think Dennett. I mean, I mentioned Dennett, but there's a whole
not the mainstream though. That's important. I'm not just saying like, oh, don't write off analytic metaphysics. I'm saying specifically people who are doing a not the orthodox position. That's important.
Say that again. I don't understand the point you're making.
My point was that I'm not talking about someone like Dennett. I'm pointing people to the developing, but not the dominant position is still the Humean mechanistic pacifist position.
Yes, I think that's true. But I mean, as you say, there are resources, and I do think Dennett, I've found him anyway, very illuminating about these sorts of issues. And there's a whole literature that's developed in that sort of field. By the way, I mean, this is just by the by, but I sort of balk side here. You're talking about this mechanistic philosophy as a Humean one, although Hume is certainly, a major exponent of it. I mean, it really dates back, I mean, I quoted Locke repeatedly. I mean, it's part of the whole empiricist tradition, Newtonian tradition, and I don't, I mean, Hume perhaps expresses it more clearly and more paradoxically, of course, also than other writers. I've always found Locke, I think, a very important figure here, really a very important figure, not studied so much nowadays, but might as well call it Locke. It's empiricist. It's the whole empiricist, mechanistic empiricist tradition, I think, that we're talking about here. I don't expect we disagree about that. Aristotle. Now, Aristotle rather than Hegel. Well, I mean, let's not put it in those sort of, terms of alternative and conflict. I mean, Aristotle is a hugely important figure in thinking about nature and about mind. I think also, and in an integrated way. I entirely agree with that, and I think he's a hugely important, perhaps the most important influence on Hegel. I mean, Hegel's very much in that tradition. But I think the great difference between Aristotle and Hegel is that Aristotle doesn't think about nature historically in evolutionary terms, and I mean that and although Hegel is at the brink of that, I mean, I think that the dialectical side of Hegel's work is to think in terms of change and development, And I think that's something that really he adds to that tradition, which is enormously important. And that's, of course, where conflict and contradiction come in. Though I agree, I wasn't focusing. I mean, I just, I wasn't sort of making very much of the role that the concept of contradiction plays here. I made more of that in earlier lectures. But because I was really arguing against the view that there are no contradictions, there are no, there's no dialectic in nature. I was arguing against that view in order to show that it seems to me that really underlying that position, which is extremely common in the Marxist tradition and in the Hegelian tradition, that view embodies a dualism, which I think, and I think the most important thing that Engels is spelling out, for which he's almost never given proper credit, is really a very interesting way of thinking materialistically, in a non-reductive, materialistic way about nature in all its aspects. That was really the theme of this lecture.
Okay, before I bring in Simon, Tom from Canada has a question, but his microphone is acting up. So a brief question about Engels' treatment of dialectic. I'm heartened by your defense of his treatment of dialectical accounts of nature, especially to the extent that they correct the seemingly unfair condemnation of Engels in recent generations. My question is, what do you say to the criticism that Engels neglected the treatment of dialectic at the level of thought, that his notion of dialectic, particularly its famous rules, more or less just read off the dialectic that inheres in the natural world? He sees dialectic only from the side of nature, or in an almost simplistic materialist fashion. Nature develops for Engels, but not so much thought itself. While he might agree that nature admits of contradictory predication, he does not really develop these insights at the level of thought alone. Not disconnected thought, of course, the way thinkers like Hegel or contemporaries like Dialectic, Adorno or Bhaskar have done. So that's Tom's question.
Well, I think that's a very, I'd like to, shame he's not here to speak that point, because rather a puzzling thing to say about Engels, actually. Of course he believes that, there's a dialectic of thought as well as in nature. It seems to me strange to suggest otherwise. The laws of, that he quotes, the supposed laws of dialectic, I think are rather, are simplistic and not terribly helpful. But they do capture, I think, some of the aspects of Hegel's philosophy, which undoubtedly operative. I think I tried to say that in the first lecture. I tried to show how Marx particularly, but Engels too, as I put it in the first lecture, take Hegel's logic, certain features of Hegel's logic, and summarize them. And the most important ones, I think, out of the first initial sections of the logic are that everything is, you must see things in relation, as finite as he puts it, and see things as sort of infected by contradiction and in a process of change and development. Those ideas, I think, are summarized in what are Engels' laws of nature, that the unity of opposites. What's the second one? I can't even remember them, but it seems to me that they are very, they are saying something like the same things. As I said at the end of that first lecture, it seems to me that it's arbitrary and limiting to think that there are only three, laws of dialectic in that way. The principle of dialectical thought that can be extracted from all aspects of Hegel's logic. I mean, one aspect that I didn't talk about, which I think is very important and useful, and again, Engels focuses on it perhaps inordinately, is the transition of quantity into quality, quantitative into qualitative change, and vice versa. I mean, I could certainly, that's something I haven't covered in these lectures and should have done, no doubt.
Okay, Simon.
Yeah, thank you for a very excellent series of lectures. I just have a fairly simple question. It's you're very familiar, and you highlighted at the start of your lecture this idea that people counterpose Marx against Engels, and they sort of suggest that Engels didn't really understand Marx, and they have some very differing views, which I don't find terribly plausible myself. Marx tended not to get on with people he didn't agree with fundamentally. Well, I actually found the first reference to this in the 7th Congress of the Comintern. I wish they were defending Engels, in fact, there. But where did these ideas come from, and who is it who really tried to suggest that Engels, dismiss Engels and suggest that Marx is, and you only need to read Marx and you don't just bother with Engels, and that kind of, I mean, I still meet these people to this day. We're peddling this kind of view. I'm expecting you to have a long list of names of people who do so.
It's sometimes attributed to Lukács, to History and Class Consciousness. I mean, it's only a sentence in fact, it's in a footnote in History and Class Consciousness, where he says that Engels essentially invented the idea of a dialectic of nature, and suggests that it's not part of Marxism. But I don't know the sort of prehistory of that, but it certainly was going by the early 1920s, and it's been, it's hugely common. I mean, it's I think it's very, very, I mean, in this respect anyway, really completely, there's absolutely there's no theoretical, I mean, there's no historical basis for it. I mean, historically speaking, Engels, I mean, the main place that Engels explains these ideas is in Anti-Düring, which he composed while Marx was still alive. He read it all out to Marx. They discussed it themselves. I mean, if Marx had serious objections to what Engels was saying, I mean, we'd know about that. I mean, and so would have Engels. I mean, I think it's just absurd, quite honestly, that it's people who want to put upon on Marx, the sort of philosophy that I'm criticizing here, the sort of dualist Kantian reading of metaphysical ideas that I think is complete misunderstanding. But I mean, that's what motivates it. The history of it, as I say, I mean, it certainly was going by. I mean, there was Kantian influence in Marxism in the early 20th century was very, very strong, and I think it's an expression of that. Yeah,
because some of the sort of new lefty type, people obsessed with abstract labor and those sort of people gone about traditional Marxism, orthodox Marxism, and criticize that. They're the sort of people that peddle this kind of stuff now.
Well, I mean, they're very, it's the mainstream, really, version. The sort of thing I'm saying is highly unusual, I would, eccentric. I mean, to be such an orthodox Marxist as I am is really, really, way out there. It's.
Okay, Nabosa.
Thank you for the lecture. Question from paleontological point of view. It is really a question: which natural process is contradiction in itself? For example, natural process. We don't count people in nature. Only people that we have the cultural traces of, we don't count into nature anymore. So out of that derailment of nature, which natural process that we know of is contradictory, or dialectical, to say?
All of them. I mean, dialectic is at work in everything, I say. I mean, if you want, I mean, one of the examples that Hegel gives repeatedly and came up in, I mean, I didn't follow it up in my lecture, but the notion of, I mean, in mechanics, the notion of force. A force is always met with a counterforce. Action and reaction, as Newton puts it, are equal and opposite. You can't have, you know, I mean, there's all, whatever natural processes there are, it's because they are, that conflict and contradiction is at work in them. I would say that every single process, any process you can name, has conflict involved in it.
Okay, have we any other questions? Now, Bozo, you're going to have to unmute if you want to say something, but please keep it short.
All these processes that you see as dialectical are mechanistic. There is no natural force that is not materialistically explainable.
Yes, and they're mechanistic.
It appears to us as something dialectical, but in itself, this is just material mechanical processes.
Yes, I mean, material processes, first of all, aren't purely mechanical. They are, every material process has a mechanical aspect, but that's an, you know, it's an abstraction. I mean, no process, on the other hand, is purely mechanical. They all are, I agree. I mean, everything, every material process has a mechanical aspect to it. There's every single one of them. But that doesn't mean they're non-dialectical, which I think is the assumption you're making. The mechanical aspect is just one aspect, and mechanics, the science of the theory of mechanics, the science of mechanics, abstracts that mechanistic aspect and considers it in isolation and on its own. In reality, in nature, things, you know, it's always in combination with other things. It's never, nothing is ever purely mechanical. That's an unreal abstraction, a very useful one, an incredibly important one, but nevertheless an abstraction.
Have we any other questions? Ruth?
Okay, one just fast. I don't mean never read Hegel. And I agree with you exactly about Hegel introducing history. My point was narrower, was that the thing about Aristotle is that you don't get the law talk mixed in. So you can really see a kind of powers-based, integrated, non-dualistic, non-pacifist metaphysics. You can see that clearly in Aristotle, even if he doesn't have the historical part, because I mean, the laws part. But that's not that. You can respond to that if you want. But my question, just following up on the last person, is let's take an example, like, because I'm curious too, just what you actually mean. So, like, let's say salt, and I'll put this in non-mechanistic terms. Okay, so and I agree with you about Locke, but Locke is still has a little, he's sort of a transitional figure. But in any case, we'll put it in neo-Aristotelian or non-mechanistic terms. Salt, given what it is, has certain powers, certain capacities. They're not conscious ones, but that's okay. And it's got the power to dissolve ice. And we see a process of dissolution when you put those two together, the expression of a power. So that's a way to describe it that doesn't have anything to do with laws governing inert bits of matter. So I'm just genuinely curious. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm curious what should I be seeing in a process like that I should be properly calling contradiction?
Well, when you talk, I mean, when you talk powers, which is fine, I'm quite happy with that. I mean, I'm not terribly happy with your complete rejection of the notion of laws, but anyway, let's leave that aside. I mean, there are regularities in nature, which is what the notion of laws refers to, and that seems okay to me. But anyway, powers, okay, powers. Salt has certain powers to interact with other things, and it's through in interacting with other things, it's conflicting with other things, and it always does. I mean, it never. Salt always exists in. You mean sodium chloride type salt? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm just thinking of a simple example of like salt dissolving ice, and I'm just curious what part of that causal process.
Well, there's a process going on there, which is the conflict of, the salt having an impact, an effect, and conflicting with the state of ice, the frozen state of water. I mean, that surely has to be thought of in terms of conflicting influences, forces at work in the realm of chemistry.
Well, I guess it's the surely part, but that's helpful. So the contradiction is the fact that the salt has the power to dissolve ice, and
when they come into contact, I mean, salt, salt on its own, I mean, never on its own, but simply in a jar, say, where it's not. I mean, it will interact with something, even in the jar, but the minute you put it onto the ice, you're introducing a force that I mean, and I'm not sure quite how this works, but it, that is influencing, which is conflicting with the current state of the ice, and there is, and that leads to change. I mean, that leads to the ice melting, to the salt dissolving, to a new condition, to change. I just would have thought that was, I mean, my memory of the language of chemistry, it's a long time since I studied chemistry, but I mean, it seems quite obvious to me that, well, it's surely, I shouldn't say that. Okay, it seems that to me that one very obvious way of understanding this process is that when they're brought into contact, the ice and the salt affect each other, conflict with their current states, and lead to change in each other.
I must admit,
and that's not. I mean, that's just a physical, if you like, physical chemistry. I mean, it's not. There's no actual chemical interaction there, but it's a physical chemical change.
I must admit, Sean, I think maybe the use of the word conflict as opposed to in contradiction might be part of the issue here. Anything like salt is first an abstraction. You're taking it away from its world. It needs to be put back into its historical and material world, in that spatio-temporal context. Within that, it itself both has contradictions, things rot, things grow, and insofar as it cannot be understood in the real world without relation, there are contradictions because those relations produce pertinent effects. And that's the way I would see the dialectic of nature. That contradiction is always there. There is always a dialectical process in whatever thing you choose to abstract, and between and necessarily relationally with all those other things it interacts with in a spatio-temporal moment. And what moves those contradictions forward is temporality, it's time. And
well, they move forward in time. Wait a minute, time doesn't create them. I mean, yes, they move forward in time. The change occurs, and the properties of salt, to dissolve ice, to corrode iron, and whatever other properties it has. These are properties which arise because its properties manifest themselves and conflict with the existing properties of iron and ice. I mean, there is a. I mean, now why talk about contradiction? Because it's within, because it's within a unity. I mean, it's not just one separate thing. In a sort of, again, a sort of Humean way, followed by another separate thing, one event followed by another event. It's these things are locked together. They're in unity.
I think my point was, in the language of contradiction in that way sounds better than conflict.
Oh, okay. Well, I agree with
It's an
that.
issue
Yeah.
of precision. For me, that's a precise distinction. And I also think in that respect, with Naboja just put on the chat, if the contradiction is just in our mind, you are setting up a situation where the methodology by which we seek to understand does not have a relationship with the ontology of what we're understanding. So I think contradiction has to be in the thing as well as in the mind. Otherwise, we're just going back to the sort of notion of a definite dualist separation. And I
totally
don't think
agree
that's
with
there.
that. Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. Absolutely.
If I can just add
Quickly, yeah.
This is why I asked to name me the event from natural history known to us, or from nature in general, that is conflictual and contradiction in itself. I'm saying you, as a natural scientist, there's no such thing. It exists only in our mind, it is okay, but in itself, these all processes are explainable, and they have their material ground and mechanical dynamics, to put it simply. So the thing that we don't understand them and cannot get through their complexity without contradicting our knowledge and our unknowledge, this is okay, but this is not nature. So we are not nature anymore. I mean, it's a complex thing, and I think especially with Hegel didn't know for evolution. So in fact, he didn't know what is the passage of historical time, of natural historical time. But the time, geological time, is dimension that is, I mean, something that totally changes the understanding of nature. Because our moment of our lives, or science that we can use today, this is just a moment. This is just a blink. And we cannot understand things if we don't understand how much time passed in articulating all this matter, all these relations, all these processes that we probably know only 1% of, even on our own planet. So a little bit of relation towards nature makes us more, to say, aware of our restriction. Of course, it's hard to grasp all that, and this is frustrating, very frustrating. So we say it's contradiction. It's contradiction for ourselves. It has its laws, it has its dynamics, it has billions of proofs that everything goes on this materialist and mechanical level. I'm saying mechanical, this is vulgar word, but anything that we know of out of our psychology, to say, our own species, is materialistic, is mechanical, is explained, it's chemistry, biology, gravitation, cosmic influence, terrestrial forces, history of the, I mean, there's nothing, otherwise we fall into mysticism.
Okay.
We are becoming.
I'm very puzzled by this, because I spend a lot of time in my lecture saying that everything is mechanical and chemical and physical. I mean, there's no dispute between us about that. I think you're talking as though to say something is contradictory is to say it's either incomprehensible or purely thought. And I mean, I just spent an hour trying to argue against that view.
Okay. Thomas, did you want to ask a brief question?
Yes, but because now I'm not sure of if I am right, so I will keep it down.
Well, I'm not entirely sure any of us know we're right. Any other questions? Very, very quickly. Okay. If there are not, can I just say thanks very much to Sean for 6 fascinating lectures, which we hope in due course will be a book that we'll all buy. Thanks to you for participating.